So I think, as we're at 10:02, I think we've got our numbers coming back. So I'm going to welcome everybody back to this session, which I'm very excited about because, well, not only is Anna my supervisor, but it is absolutely fantastic to have an anthropologist and a theologian who both work on the same topic around immigration, speaking from different disciplines. So this feels to me like a really key moment around interdisciplinary discovery of what lived Catholicism is. So I'm very grateful to both of you for being with us for this session today. And I'm going to hand over to Anna and leave you in her capable hands to chair this session.
Thank you so much, Avril. We're obviously hugely in your debt and Pat's debt and everybody else who's been involved in organising these 2 days. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to be around myself more due to sort of term time teaching commitments. And I understand that Professor Valentina Napolitano is also in the same position. She's also been very busy with term time commitments, so she's racing in to join us at this point. So we're hugely grateful for you making this time to be with us. Professor Napolitano is an anthropologist of religion, but who ranges really widely in a spectacularly interdisciplinary way across political theologies, Catholic theology, anthropology, critical theory, and so forth. So we're absolutely delighted. You're the sort of instantiation of a lived Catholicism approach in scholarship. So we're hugely delighted that you've been able to be with us today. And the title of the paper that we're about to hear, which will then lead into some dialogue between the two of us, is Living Catholicism, Potentialities and Limitations from an Anthropological Perspective. So that's a nicely paradoxical title to lead into. So Valentina, thank you so much and you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your introduction. And I wanted to thank you very much, Gabriel, and everybody else involved in the organization of this, which I know it's quite a lot. And I just wanted to start with a small well, it's not small, it's a big land acknowledgement. You know, I speak from Toronto, so I wish to acknowledge this land in which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Senecale, the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and I am very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So I just wanted to acknowledge where I actually stand, the soil that I stand. Okay, so my presentation, as Anna said very briefly, really comes, I'm a social cultural anthropologist, so my intervention is from that kind of perspective. So during an initial conversation I had with Avery Bigent on the conference titled Paradox and Prophecy, she poignantly posed this tension in a form of a question. How it comes that from anthropology, what is asked is why Catholicism is so enduring, and from theology is the opposite, why Catholicism is dwindling. I am intrigued by this tension, and so I hope to shed some light on the matter by focusing my reflection on two themes, life and family. But let me start first with a short anthropological vignette. So I'm just sharing my screen very briefly, that I hope you see now, just for a short while, and then I turn it off. A black and white polished Christ can be seen through a fence as it occupies a corner of the private garden in the Catholic Seminary of the Sacred Heart in Detroit. Situated in a historical area of the city that has suffered consistent infrastructure deterioration over the last 50 years, the seminary earned its ground and encoded the ethnographic history of urban strife. With a black face and a white mantle, arms outstretched and welcoming, the marble statue offers a gesture of peace, yet his layers of paint reveal the racial antagonism of the city in conflict with itself. Originally painted white, then painted black, repainted white, and then the face finally painted black during the 1967 city riots. The statue indexes way in which a holy infrastructure, such as the Catholic Church, is a racial battleground between local Black population and the waves of mainly Polish and Italian immigrants community that comprised then and later the heart of the so-called flight to the suburbs away from the center of Detroit. Now, the children of this flight are coming back to live in the center of Detroit, and to harness the strength of this new incoming Catholic generation is a matter at the core of the Detroit current archdiocese is planning. It is August 2019, and I'm on site conducting research with a team of students, and I want particularly to thank Dr. Stephen Berquist, who was with me during the research. We stand in a corner of this beautiful and maintained compound in the neighborhood of Jameson, flanked on one side by Chicago Boulevard. The site is a paradox of exclusive cultivation and disarray. In an area in much need of infrastructure improvement, with its cracked pavements, overgrown tree roots, and damp grounds, particularly with respect to stormwater runoff and flooding. The Sacred Heart Major Seminaries arises from and is nurtured by this soil, yet in many respects it still does not belong to this area of urban Detroit. And while this is a reference also to the Sacred Heart, I wanted to say that the Catholic Church in Detroit is very polyphacetic, and this is just a very other kind of index of a different type of Catholic Church, which was around St. Agnes, with then a church that was closed. It was kind of merged to another one in the 1990s. And this was in celebration of priest Farrell work there. So it's a very different sort of infrastructure of the Sacred Heart, the Black Sacred Heart. Okay, let me stop sharing screen for the time being. Stop here. This snapshot offers an ethnographic lens into ways in which the Catholic Church in a specific locality may be complicit in complex dynamics of racialization as they intersect multiple layering and processes of migration and urban transformation. It also invites us to think the political ramification of what constitutes a holy infrastructure through particular terrains, and how a holy designation may be theologically constituted as an inscription of an ongoing and partially failing performative sovereignty of partition, the case obviously of the Polish Christ. Here I'm seeing a Catholic Church that is formed by the elementals, the soil, the water, the heat, the fire, and living spaces of gathering and rituals. The coming into being of infrastructure, they may well take their force together in articulation as theological substances. To study holy infrastructure is to study the coming into beings of an intertwinement of sovereignty, sanctity, soils, and the elementals, and how these intertwinements orient different forms of life. My perspective and methodology into this research are informed by critical Catholic studies. With critical Catholic studies, I mean the integrative field of sociocultural anthropology, political theology, and religious studies, inputting the church into focus as a passionate machine, as I define it in my work, while drawing renewed critical attention to Catholicism, complex and geopolitical investment in questions of belonging, reproduction, and sovereignty. Embedded in ethnographic sensibility and its potential, this approach explored the global Catholic Church as a political, pedagogical, theological, and ethical subject. It also has one of these registers on the paradoxical force of the Catholic Church complexio oppositorum. Catholicism as political form, and I quote here the work of Andrea Molenbeek, embodies both the rational juridical and the dignity of the civitas humana, both the technocratic and the moral, both the concrete and the abstract. Its forms is uniquely generative because it encompasses incommensurables while keeping them in productive tension, close quote. As Carl Schmitz reminds us, in fact, Catholicism is good at keeping opposite in complexio oppositorum in this productive tension. Yes, at times, this is a dynamic in which what is killed is the faith of the other, cannibalized via an ecumenical discourse. And I'm referring here to the work of Maya Maigley. Cannibalism, seen particularly in relation to the Eucharist, is a constitutive paradox of Catholicism. Broadly speaking, since the formation of the Jesuit order and the globalization of missionary and colonial expansion, the Catholic Church has navigated a tension and a mutual reinforcement of the word and the sword. However, geopolitically and historically, we are now facing a different challenge entangled in planetary dimension of predatory capitalism. The battleground is not anymore between the word and the sword, but it is now on capitalism and life. As Luke Bretherton and Ryan Juskin beautifully put in a recent blog, quote, "In the language of Genesis, the human, in Hebrew, Adam, is made of the soil, Adama. A spirit-bred soil, humans are created out of the same ground shared by all beings, animate and inanimate alike. To care for and cultivate the soil is at the same time to care for and cultivate what it means to be human. And the soil bears the scars of how we mistreat each other." Close quote from Bretherton and Just. The Catholic philosopher Roberto Esposito has helped to qualify life beyond the Agamben's well-known distinction of Zoe, an unqualified life, and bios, a qualified life. Esposito suggests paying attention to that life, which is standing in precarious but also potential creative ways in a space of the common. The common is what stands between what is public, communitas, and what is private, immunitas. This latter a life that has a capacity of killing in order to defend one's own survival. The common, here we are invited to think the battle on and for life beyond the conflation of modernity with the Christian eschatology, but instead to think it as an uncharted potential terrain, a new mode of being in common that is not captured or exhausted by a private public division. This middle ground requires a new legal and civil language of care and imagination of a life that is in common and which is oriented in a durative present, not in a hopeful or apocalyptic transcendental future. Together with Carlotta McAllister in a larger work on theopolitics and the relation between anthropological study of sovereignty and apophatic theology, which I'm quite glad as I hear other people talking about in this conference, we have argued to embrace a reading of Catholicism hinging on a presence for acting in and on time rather than in a future perfect. And I quote, "A future perfect that modernity imposes on political projects as the condition of doing justice and ethically anchor themselves instead in the durative present. Yet, even with Christianity, the end times are more differentiating than this conflation would suggest, multiplying possibility for acting in and on time beyond retrenchment in the immanent." Close quote. Theopolitics engages a theos that emerge in the vulnerable spaces of the movement. And this is again, Massimo Fagioli was talking about this movement to start with this conference, between the cataphatic and the apophatic, a space of what is decided and yet is not fully implemented as a state of exception, especially in relation to sovereignty. This space points always toward the provisional side of the law, here referring to the work of mystic Martin Buber, rather than its transcendental roots in the name of the power of stating the exception, the decision of sacrifice lives for justice, which is of course the position of Carl Schmitt. Theopolitics obliged to rethink unhelpful secular divides between religion and politics, where instead we are called to pay renewed attention to the intersection of political, theological, social, and environmental justice. I propose here then a focus on live-in Catholicism in its gerunding forms to rendering the space. A live-in perspective put into focus the study and participation toward the Catholic eschatological immanence of acting in and on time toward the process of justice and of doing the work of undoing injustice. The living Catholicism builds clearly on a robust tradition of the study of lived Catholicism. And I'm referring here, it has been used a lot by anthropologists, the lived Catholicism. I know it's been used in very many different ways, and the lived Catholicism, attention to material religion and embodies sensorial mediated hermeneutics between people, God, and saintly figure. Yet it puts living Catholicism, an immanent eschatology of justice and the doing the work of injustice, of course, also in a decolonial sense, at its center. So a methodological study of Catholicism that is lived, narrativized, and observed is important, but should not be contained by its hermeneutical loop. It should embrace the ground of negative methodology and of, as well, negative political theology to help us to apprehend the violence as well the strength of Catholicism, particularly in conditions in which the archive has been vehemently annihilated, well beyond reach, or left in rubbles. And I think about the work of Sajia Hartman here and Yael Navarro. This is, to me, the methodology and political theological tool we need to embrace to shed light and respond to obliterating terrain of violence, such as in the case of the Canadian Catholic residential school. Yet, a strength of Catholicism is instead to connect to spaces of vulnerability in common. What Anna Rowlands here, in a time of COVID, rereading the lesson from Gillian Rowe's reflection on the third city, beyond Athens and Jerusalem's form of sociality, calls the broken middle. For our purpose here, is it clear that the battle between life and capitalism, we are all entangled, is not only happening at the semantic level of the meaning of life, lived, living Catholicism. It happens in immanent incarnated domains. Ethnographically speaking, Catholicism is a contested terrain, an immanent condition of multiple and conflicted sovereignty. This is the case, for example, in the ensoulment in which a life is considered and become for some sacralized or desecrated. Let me share again. The last picture that is taken here is a picture of Detroit from the Church of the Grotto, which is a church of the Tridentine kind of liturgy, and is also one of the center of the militant church in Michigan. And you can see is the tomb to the unborn baby and fetus. This is a terrain, so asking myself, doing fieldwork there, this is a terrain in which anthropology may well ask what forms of affective mobilization are at stake in this parish and why they may be so enduring. In the meantime, theologians perhaps ask what is the loss or transformation required by a church in Detroit and beyond when a faith and a certain forms of life sovereignty is a structure of feeling that is residual, not emergent. Let's start to share it here. So a battleground on life, which I just tried to very briefly render, as intrinsically connect to justice, arches back and life sovereignty, arches back to ways in which Catholicism means being mentioned in the triangulation of life, modes of living, and the law. In a beautiful work on 13th, 14th century Franciscan order, Agamben studies economia, a Christian Trinitarian root of the management of the household, that arches back to Franciscan debate on a refusal of property, and foregrounds instead modes of living in common that can never be fully reduced to, and therefore ruled by, a sovereignty of the law with a capital L. In Franciscan friar theological terms, a primacy of the political sovereignty of the King, Christ, is undone by a vita Christi, a mode of living in common, what is called by Agamben the highest of poverty. A critical, but also by Cecil Robinson, who is kind of an anthropologist, very interesting kind of Black anthropologist. A critical Catholic studies perspective sees here an intersectional understanding of the work of economic theology and anthropologists going to the core debates on the nature of law and substance, the commons, and therefore of capitalism and life. Let me state, though, that to study and engaging with living Catholicism and its decolonial potential is not to shy away from re-engaging classical canons, such as, for instance, an Enlightenment-based performative reflexive consciousness as apprehended by a dialogical humanism or the study of religion. And I'm thinking here the work of Jennifer Hurd. Without throwing away the baby with the bathwater is indeed to re-engage the canon anew through a work that anthropologists doing fieldwork know very well, that is to be not at ease. Potential intersection between living and lived Catholicism with theological inquiry should be held as a space of unease between different disciplinary knowledges. We all need skeptical interlocutors and to inhabit spaces out of our comfort zone. One way to think the space methodologically is to follow what Sarah Coakley refers as, quote, moving into a dark intimacy with theos, close quote, as a, open quote again, journey into the Trinitarian revelatory mystery, close quote. An enticing, disorienting, and incarnated journey for which we are given no map. Anyway, I hope my first point is clear by now. It is an invitation to study and ultimately engaging with the multiple sides of Catholicism, not only as a lived domain, but actually in its gerunding forms of living domains, open to provisional orientation to justice, where we are given no map, and by so doing, engage in a work of undoing injustice anew. My second and final point of reflection on lived and living Catholicism is to draw attention to the ambivalence of family as being both a form and a substance. And I here thank you, one of the PhD candidate working with me, Jacob Besson, to really work very well on this area. So to be in both a form and a substance, this is another paradox which is at the center of Catholicism and which is ingrained in the family with capital F. Catholicism in its multiple ways of incarnated exchange require a constant remaking of personhood, and as such it informs the political in its imagination, economic, and incarnated registers. As I've argued in collective work with Christine Norgert and Maya Meiblin in the Anthropology of Catholicism reader, a core of Catholicism proclivity is to form chains of mediation, say between the dead and the living, between people and saints, and between people and nation states and the earth, that exceed the intentionality of single individuals. Hence, Catholicism can be approached as a living ecology that produces both enabling and exploitative patterns. Family is also the complex social renderings of this living ecology. And also theological mystery of the Holy Trinity. And it also the bedrock, the family, of societal taboo and interdiction. As such, who perpetuates a breaking of a taboo, going against the law, becomes the personification of taboo itself, an outcast to the law. Agamben argues that with the Council of Trent, Opus Dei, the work and labor of God, may coincide opus operate, the effect of the liturgy as such, with opus operans, the nature of the agent performing the liturgical act. The ground of this coincidence is charted on the Holy Trinity and the salvific relation between Father and Son. The mystery of salvation becomes from then on the mysterious ground for both the familia and the family. Contrary to Agamben analysis, though, Antonio Negri has argued that there is an historicity to form of accumulation and dispossession, violence and reproduction that take place through the formation of the family, the familia, and the placement of the domus within its economia. The domus then is the terrain where taboo, form and substance come together in enabling as well disenabling and violent ways. Think about, for example, domestic female violence, domestic violence. Hence, the family, the domus, is a living crucible within and beside contemporary Catholicism, made particularly poignant by the paradoxical tension between life and capitalism. Papal intervention has clearly shaped and reshaped language, catechesis, and theological orientation on the relation between Holy Trinity and the family since, but also very well before, the Second Vatican Council. Changing papal accent on personhood have shown multiple accountability and orientation on and around the family, from a mobilization, aesthetization of moral collective and consciousness, of course, Paul VI, to making and remaking of public and intimacy, John Paul II, from a concern with inheritance and heritage, Benedict XVI, and the exhortation toward an ecological self, of course, Francis. In Humane Vita, Paolo VI places a renewed stress on a language of morality and sacrament of marriage. Catholic personhood is here firmly connected to a morality held by the family as an institution, one sanctified by the rite of marriage that makes the heteronormative family the hinge between divine and state law. It is with John Paul II that the sanctity of the marriage is invested of an indissoluble link, difficult word, to procreation. The family then becomes a sanctuary of life, in John Paul II word. Even more, the family, which has already been invested with a moral potency, short circuits the domestic, the domus, with life, and by doing so grants the family with a central role in the building on John Paul II new evangelization. Yet it is with Benedict XVI that the family becomes the cradle for the reproduction of the Christian heritage, both in the sacrality of an alliance, the sacrament of marriage, but also in the reanimation of Catholic roots and imagined origins. Parents have a right and obligation, I quote, then to transmit the Christian heritage to their children, in the words of Benedict XVI. For Pope Francis, instead, more than ever, Catholic personhood is rooted in an ecological transformation that, in times of COVID-19 and climate change, hinges on the link between the Kairos time of rupture and crisis and the Jubilee and the time of Jubilee and reconciliation, especially in Laudato Si, of course. Francis, as the first ever Latin American Pope, is not particularly moved by an exhortation of the family as the cradle of the transmission of the Catholic, particularly European heritage. As a Pope from the Americas and as a Criollo Pope, as I've written about Francis, as a Criollo Pope, his emphasis is not on lineage and descent, but more on new form of alliances that should be engendered and mobilized for a rejuvenation of Catholicism, especially in Europe. With the Criollo Pope, I mean the twofold nature of a Criollo charisma of Francis. Criollo means the one born in the Americas from European parents. That's the definition of Criollo, in one of the definitions in the Americas, who cannot be fully radical. So there is a paradox in Francis, that as a Criollo Pope, who cannot be fully radical in his own land, thinking here of Francis' contested visit to Chile in 2018, yet may well be potential radical in the metropolis, since he's refusing or condemning homosexuality in a return trip from Brazil in 2013. A Criollo Pope is then paradoxically perceived both as a trickster, nearly heretic, and as a much needed reformer of the Catholic Church at large. So I come to my last page. In Laudato Si, Francis has reignited a long debate about the nature of dominion, possession, and property, while positing lack of care for the earth as a sin of humanity because its effects on social inequality, the poor, and the sickness, a quote, evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. So going back to the elemental, close quote, that I mentioned at the beginning. The provocation, the prophetic of such intervention rests fundamentally upon an extension of scale, the scale domain that the Pope has been addressing, from an implicit recognition of the importance of the nation state and its citizens to the ancient seeming but also deeply contemporary calling on to action for the denizens of the earth and transnational migrants, that is as one social, biological, earthly and cosmic. While rescaling home and the family, Francis called for new new forms of politics of dwellings and emplacement, both pivotal queries in the historical formation of the Criollo consciousness in the Americas. So politics of dwelling is a very historical, well, transhistorical affective category in that sense. As mentioned above, family holds a paradoxical tension in Catholicism of form and substance. Through an ethnographic lens, we can appreciate a fluidity of the structure of the Catholic family based on exchange and a form of domus that undergoes cyclical crisis, yet regenerates itself. However, we also see Catholicism charting, mediating a fear of a loss of an heteronormative family, seen as the bedrock of a Catholicism of the metropolis. Especially in European Catholicism, a double temporality may well be at play. The loss of a future, of a desire and normative condition of the family, while a temporality of immigration is reshaping a tale of modernity. The family form is still a kernel for a societal redemption and salvation. Yes, the substance, the carnality of that family is changing, both a nature of modern European democracy, together with European Catholicism tales of modernity. So the problem of the substance here comes back to family substance. Rowlands reminds here there is a profound connection between Catholic theology and European asylum law, building upon Talmudic law prohibition to harm and injunction to love the stranger. The Catholic Church has imagined extending care to everybody in distress as a sign of salvation. Yet in a practice and the coming into being on migrant personhood, that caring may have duplicitous effect. And that's where the ethnographic studies are important. In my own research on women of Latin American origin attending the Catholic mission in Rome, I pointed out how the Catholic Church brings into the fold this migration, yet migrant gender subjectivity never fits fully the expectation of his own catechesis. A constitutive duplicitous paradox here takes place through the figure of the stranger migrant. On the one hand, from the church, the desire for new blood, for a rejuvenation of the Catholic Church, overlooks the fact that this migration mobility is often the product of the incapacity of the family, marriage, and the nation, the same church, to contain the desire for migration itself. Yet exactly this incapacity of containment of her persona, the migrant subject, is never completely fitting into the pastoral family catechesis. Ethnographically speaking, to interrogate the figure of the stranger through Catholicism is to take in forms in different contexts, the trans-Mediterranean, the US-Mexican border, and as we speak, the Polish and the Belarus borderland, is then to engage with modes of living and pedagogies that put in motion multiple aesthetics, sensorial ways of becoming, as well as annihilated, but also in some cases, messianic forms of violence. Achille Mbembe has recently argued that the battle of life is nowadays inscribed by geomorphic power, where the epistemic hegemony of techne has become the new language of reason. Hence, how we orient ourselves through this may be well toward the work of undoing justice at the interstices of this hegemonic techne of life, while inhabiting a Catholic threshold anew, a grounding common of a broken middle out of our comfort zone. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I'm sure there will be lots and lots of thoughts and questions and sort of, you know, sets of associations that will have been set off in people's minds. So we'll get the fruits of some of that in the question and answer afterwards. But we've got a little bit of time now, just to let people know what's going to happen now. We've got a little bit of time now where I have a chance to just ask some questions, and there can be some dialogue between myself and Valentina, and then we'll welcome you into that. So hopefully during the time that Valentina and I are engaging a little bit around some of the core ideas in her paper, which is what I'm going to pull out in a moment, the kind of things that struck me and that I'm wanting to just sort of delve into a bit further. This will give you thinking time to think about the questions that you would like to bring into the conversation as well. So Valentina, thank you so much. There's one line that I just sort of wanted to pull out, which felt to me as if it was a kind of a sort of statement of intent of the whole kind of project, really, and which I think it might just be helpful to remind you know, the wider conference of. I think you've given us a really powerful call to what you, just to quote you directly, call paying attention, the need to pay attention to the life which is standing in precarious but also potentially creative ways in the space of the common. Now, I think what's really interesting about this, to my mind, is that you're almost through the whole paper pulling out, or you're taking us back in a way to a language that we in the UK in particular would associate almost with the 17th century, a kind of theological radicalism around the call to the commons, a call to break down that which encloses. And quite literally in a 17th century context, that was about the enclosure of land, and the way that enclosing land then also meant enclosing bodies, and even then, you know, the sort of the possession of bodies, the using bodies in the context of slavery and exploitative work, etc. So there's a strong racialized dimension to pushing away the idea of the commons in favor of something else. So I was really struck by that kind of resonant call to return to the language of the commons, but in doing so, not to do it in a sentimental or a romanticized or naive or innocent way, but instead to pay attention as we perhaps reclaim some of that language and refind it for our own times, to do so precisely with an attention to the history of force, to the way in which violence marks that. But that violence is also not total in your account, that, you know, this is a space of potentiality and creativity, if we're able to rethink both space and time. And I think you're really interestingly pulling us back into rethinking both spatiality, and I'll come back to thinking about sort of the commons and space, perhaps in a question or two's time, but also temporality, to think what does it mean to live in time well? So helping us rethink both space and time and the dimensions of those in anthropological and theological perspective. So I thought that was all really interesting. But I want to start with a question that's really around methodology. So this is a conference that's about lived Catholicism, living Catholicism, as you're expressing it suggestively. And you note at the beginning of the paper that one of the things you want to do is explore the idea of a negative methodology and a proposal for a negative political theology. Now, there's lots of talk at the moment in a quite a suggestive, interesting way, I think, about what a negative political theology might look like. And sometimes that's a direct reference to an apophatic tradition of thinking about God in relation to negativity. But sometimes it actually means something else. It's almost an attention to either what has struggled to speak historically, what has been suppressed. So it's much more an anthropological concern with human experiences in the negative, if you like, rather than a thinking about what can or cannot be known or said or spoken about God. So I'm interested in the way in which you sort of provoke us to think about what a negative methodology, a negative political theology in the anthropological realm might look like, and why there might be a call for that. And I noted, you know, you were talking really about a negative methodology is about paying attention to spaces where violence has been a predominant reality, where there is no archive, where there are voices that have experience, but their speech has been erased, which was making me think a lot about Hannah Arendt, actually, and thinking about Arendt's incredible sort of, the thing that kept pulling Arendt back into the present and made her very suspicious of being too future orientated or romantic about the past, the things that made her want to think differently about ethics, was really to try and create a space in which those, and she uses this really significant phrase, I think, or very resonant phrase, those who feel they have no testament get to speak. Those who cannot easily find their voice in the register of what already seems to be written and rehearsed and spoken again. So I found what you were saying about a negative methodology that might need to be part of a lived Catholicism project, and one that allows us to speak of both violence and to speak into a space where maybe there is no archive, or in Arendt's language, how do we speak, those of us who feel there is no testament, into that space. So I wonder if you could flesh out a little bit, what is this negative methodology you want to propose? And, you know, when you're talking about a negative political theology, what does that mean to you?
Can I just go into this exactly what said Hartman? I'm just seeing actually the one of the way in which I'm actually thinking about negative theology. Thank you so much, and I think this is really going into not just, I think, you know, my own kind of thinking, but the thinking of a group of anthropologists, I would say, that I've been in conversation that I have to say that what is interesting, that would not be often anthropologists who consider themselves to be part of a discussion in religion, because also this is a debate that is starting, I think, in anthropology about the desecularization of anthropological theory. I think the work of Khaled Fourani, Redeeming Anthropology, you know, looking at the history of anthropology, how it has been keeping the theological at bay, thinking about, you know, displacing the culture of the otherness of the theological, the impossibility of apprehending it, and kind of displacing it into cultural otherness. And instead to kind of think this kind of theological debate and political and cosmological debate in kind of conversation as parallel and intertwining. So basically theology also be thought as a kind of cosmopolitics in that sense. So I would say that I really, one of the way of thinking political theology methodologically is to follow, for me at least, interesting, you know, those anthropologists and thinkers that are thinking about the kind of desecularization. But more interesting, I'm also thinking about the work of specifically of, exactly I mentioned before, but Yael Navarro, thinking on negative methodology, the work of Gaston Gordillo, the work of Anne Stoller as well. So these people who have formulated a certain kind of different but very interesting ideas about the power of the negative as the forms of remains, the rubbles, the kind of traces of, you know, even colonial archives that have annihilated those kind of traces. And therefore thinking, when there is no language left, then is the Saadia Hartman work, that we not intervene with the closure of language, but we actually stay with that space and try to formulate something which perhaps is also creative, that attunes to different registers, and also always seeing the partiality of that. But the questions of that becomes not so much a hermeneutical explanation of the rites of the ritual, you know, which is, you know, a very Goethean also idea that we had for quite a long time in anthropology, and, you know, Parks to kind of Goethe. But, you know, it's much more what it is the response and what is the kind of geopolitical space and time response to that space as a new articulation. So when the archive is lost, what is the new articulation? And I'm thinking exactly at kind of a set of anthropologists working also in the area in which we need a different theory of the relation between violence and objects too. So how object responds, and we cannot just think in terms of sort of vitalism, you know, the work of Jane Bennett and the certain kind of magic ontologies that kind of objects kind of all of a sudden becomes miraculous in that sense, but more thinking about the kind of continuous relation. So think in terms of the relation between person, spaces, and object as that which is constantly foregrounded and background. And the theos comes into it as a movement. So it's a movement always as a provisional movement, and yet we have to consider that which we cannot apprehend in that sense. So the negative political theology for me is definitely, it's got a root in apophatic, but apophatic in a sense, I know there is a lot of theological debates that you know much better than I do, but what I found it fascinating is that you know, it's the conditional possibility of creating space. So when you have that sense of withdrawal, it's also thinking in terms of, I mean, this is a different area, but that I've been thinking, but it's, you know, within the coming to terms to the end of a certain politics of identity as we've been knowing it in social science for a very long time, especially here in the Americas. What does it mean to think in terms of a kenotic politics? And this is something that I've been thinking recently and want to work more. What does it mean in terms of politics of withdrawal? And it's not, you know, it's not a question of minority withdrawals, but it's the qualities of making space, the kenotic power. So we can think, I think, and finally, sorry, and then finally, I think another dimensions of the negative theology as it works in this kind of methodology is to pay attention to forms of violence that tend to be, again, the debate about violence, but you know, with people and Carlotta McAllister working on theopolitics, we've been thinking a lot in terms of messianic violence, in terms of the Walter Benjamin of the violence, though the violence that of course is disrupted, but it's disrupted to create a new emerging set of justice and condition. And the body of the migrant, the space of the migrant, the time of migration, immobility and unsettlement is very much, could in some cases be read and lived as a form of messianic violence. So that is not a problem with the migrants, is the undoing of the world where we are living. So it becomes an incarnated indexical force that violent and has to undo the form that we've been living, the modes of living. rather than integration, as we know is not integration. But so I hope it gives some more thoughts in those. But there is a problem also, I know, with a messianic idea of violence, which is also prophetic, and in which way we study it anthropological and how we recognize it. But it's
Great,
I hope
great. That's really helpful. I'm going to slightly break my own rules here, and I'm going to read out Alana Harris's comment question, because it is in a sense part of the flow of the conversation that you and I have just been having. So just to say to everybody, if there's a moment where you feel that you've got a contribution that you want to make that's specifically on what Valentina and I are talking about, then do feel free to put it in, and if I can, I'll weave it in at that point. But if not, we'll try and come back to it at the end. So Alana, just because she's raising this question about I suppose that, you know, that process of trying to work out what you do with theology and what you do with religious experience in terms of study in the academy and an interdisciplinarity that really does open up the archive, and that sees that it's not just an absence of archive, but the suppression of archive. And I would also see that in terms of, you know, sort of refugee experience. But anyway, I just want to read Alana's question for you to comment. You can follow it. It's both in the Q&A and it's in the chat box for anybody who wants to follow it. You mentioned the wonderful work of Hartman and her critical levering into absences and silences in the archive. She practices critical fabulation as a methodology. Is this so Alana's asking, you know, is this a viable approach within higher education institutions that tend to valorize the disciplinary over the interdisciplinary and the empirical and critical juxtaposed against the creative, given implicit hierarchies around modes of doing scholarship, what is valorized, quantifiable, readily discernible, etc.? So we might propose, you know, exciting ways of creating new archives, but actually how viable is this approach given the disciplinary culture of higher education institutions themselves?
I will totally go with that. And I think the work we have to do is both kind of methodology and theory comes together, but always. But I'm thinking we have to do to sort of make clear what is that archive is and make kind of connections. So the work of Hartman, you know, for example, I teach it together with Desserteau, and you know, thinking about the mystic fable and the form of fabulation that Desserteau, as a kind of Jesuit anthropologist and historian, did, and the work of Hartman sort of brings another aspect to Desserteau. It's also a critique to Desserteau. So how do we constellate? And I was very glad to see Massimo Fagioli going back to Henri de Lubac at the beginning, because there are connections between Henri de Lubac and Michel Desserteau, and in a way Hartman, so that we make this connection also across canon. Because, you know, with this kind of fugitive anthropology, with sort of abolitionist anthropology, you know, with the decolonial critique, we need also to make connections of Hindus, of people who have done it in a very difficult setting, very different power relations, but done similar work. So in that sense, I think it's a very creative, has to be multidisciplinary. And once again, you know, quoting Amy Hollywood, you know, why theory has to be secular? You know, what does it mean to desecularize theory? And that creative fabulation is at the heart, which does not mean to become self-referential. Absolutely not. It's not that work. But is a work of attunement, is a work of is a work of kind of invested how would we say, precision of a certain rigor as well. So I'm not kind of moving away from rigor, and then together with a set of kind of intuition and multi-sensorial way of working. And how do we bring it together? I don't think it's just experimental. I don't think I put the experimental versus the canonical. I think it's a way where we are obliged in terms of responding exactly to this work of doing the work of undoing injustice, because we have to respond in a temporal and spatial ways, in creative fabulations way of intervention. Yeah.
So good. That's a good moment to move on to my next sort of set of associations and thoughts based on your paper, which was precisely to pick up this question about dwelling and emplacement. So, you know, you seem to be trying to move us to think about time and space, dwelling and emplacement in a way that would sort of create the possibility for new forms of association and relationship, and therefore a new kind of commons, which has both, as I'm understanding it in your work, a kind of a contribution of the researcher to that. But this is about a transformation, which is well beyond research. It's about the researcher's contribution to building a wider set of associations and the commons. And I was really struck by the way that you were thinking about the commons as a space between public and private. So you were posing it almost as a third space. So there's private space, there's public space, and then there's the space of the commons as a kind of third space, or as you talked about it, a middle ground. But you're also positing the idea of the commons as almost like a horizon. So it's a kind of, it's an uncharted future terrain. And on the one hand, you're playing with a tensive idea where what you want us to do is to rethink being in the now of time. And not the future perfect. You want us to be in this domain of the present, but with a sense that we're reaching towards a future which is not yet. So you don't want to remove that kind of eschatological future entirely, but you do want to take away from us the idea of the future perfect in some sense. And you talk about the way in which this middle ground, or this third space of the commons, which is both in a now urgent sense but has some future horizon to it as well, requires a new language of care and imagination. That this requires a new approach to law, to association, a different kind of structure and way of thinking. So I've got two questions about this. One is, how does the way that you're using the language of the commons relate to the classic Catholic construction of thinking about the common good, which would seem to be at least neighbouring language, but which actually might be quite different because it tends to use ideas around hierarchy. It tends to have a whole set of other grammatical associations, as it were, around that language. So you're reaching for the language of the commons, which for me has this radical kind of 17th century non-hierarchical, completely egalitarian, absolutely insisting that it's about soil and earth and land in this really kind of importantly primitive way, and not the language of the common good. So am I right that you're steering away from the language of the common good because of certain sets of associations, and you're reclaiming the language of the commons because it isn't that set of associations? Or anyway, narrate to me the relationship between the commons and the common good.
Very interesting, very, very interesting question, which I will definitely have to give much more thought. That is my immediate response now. I have to say also that, you know, my work with that of others has been in conversation with certain anthropological debates about ethics and the common good. And I have to say that some of those, you know, which are very sort of cogent and absolutely important in my field, and, you know, especially thinking the work of Joel Robbins, but they really shy away from the incarnate in the political. And I really have a problem with that. So I think that, you know, the idea of, you know, the ethical of the good, and, you know, there is quite a famous article also, Joel Robbins, on the good, and, you know, why anthropology shied away from that, and instead should kind of put that in conversation. I just say in one sentence, you know, if you read the work of Lauren Berland, and, you know, it will just come to you that sometimes we are attached to the fantasy of the good, especially in capitalism. And, you know, we have to think that tension between life and capital is constitutive. We are attached to an idea of the good, which is detrimental to us. So I'm not saying that the ethic of the good doesn't exist. Absolutely, it's very important, but we have to be much more politically attuned, much more sensitive to how the good as an horizons is also potentially extremely exploitative, especially in a condition of transformation of capitalism that we know well before COVID as based, you know, forms of voluntary labor, precarity of labor, you know, has become the common norms. And, you know, and polarization, you know, hierarchy, economic polarization. So another thing that I think is really interesting is to think the common the first way. And there, like, I'm interested, for example, to see it's not an experiment, but knowing more. I would love to know more about the initiative of L'Economia di Francesco, the common economy of Francis, that I know is kind of gathering a lot of sort of younger people, and because economic theology is fundamental here, I think. So not just for theology to help to rethink economics, but also because there is an integration between form and substance. So if you, oh God, this is me, sorry, this is really bad. I should decline it. So it just appears on the computer without me.
Don't worry at all, don't worry at all.
Whoop.
We're hyper-connected at all times.
Hyper-connected at all times. So is the idea of substance. There is wonderful work done, for example, by Eric Santner, kind of philosopher from the Chicago, The Weight of All Flesh, his book, really thinking, rethinking also Marxist theory of substance and things, and see how much they are theologically imbued, on the corpus verum Christ, how in theological tradition there is also an excess of the material which could never sort of been described in an hermeneutical way. And that is so central to Catholicism. Theories, incarnations is so good, Catholicism, to be and think with. So what I'm invited also is to think Catholic theologians and, to bring in a way out of Catholicism as, it's important, absolutely, as a sphere of lived religion, but also theologically how we can implement it and think it through social transformation, social relations that perhaps don't define themselves to be Catholic, because the profundity of certain questions around substance, for example, and I've been trying to say a little bit how it mobilizes different tensions and paradoxes within the family. So I hope I've responded. So I will definitely go with the elemental, and I will have to think again how it comes through that. Go back, I will have to, because also it connects, what I know, it connects to certain idea of cosmopolitics, in kind of Latin American, the anthropologists of the Americas, the work of Marisol de la Cadena, Steiner, like there are a lot of Arturo Escobar, there is a lot of sort of people have been really interesting to think cosmopolitics, starting from this gerundive idea of the elementals. But here we are making connections, and politics is also to expand the archives, not to exclude it. It's to make the connection that they are not being seen. That's the duty we have. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think just to finish on this one, I'm going to feed in a question from the chat. I think one of the most interesting contexts where these connections are being made in terms of the elemental and rethinking the language of the common, but doing that in a way which sees the political and economic dimensions of those, is in the work of contemporary Black theologians. So I'm thinking particularly about Willie James Jennings' work on the commons, and the way in which land and bodies have this kind of way of being thought and acted upon together. Okay, so I'm going to, just because it is, it's just on the theme of some of what you were saying in terms of, the danger with some of the common good languages, it can take place in abstraction, and therefore there can be a kind of violence in that, in that it refuses context and history, and particularly economic context and history. John Eade is asking, could Valentina say more about the changes taking place within capitalism through global flows of goods, information and images, for example, and how these global flows interact with local processes and transnational networks? In other words, capitalism is changing from colonial capitalism and globalized transnational capitalism and not homogenous, etc. So I think you're just being drawn out on some of those thoughts about capitalism in its contextual and ever-changing and migrating forms, not just human beings that migrate.
I think translation of capitalism are so kind of crucial. And, one of the things that also kind of, again, thinking the relation between religion and capitalism, again, going back to, a classic work of Walton Benjamin, it's the way in which, and the work of Elettra Stimili, for example, certain idea of the faith of religions as being transposed to the faith on the market. And so the potency of the faith of a theos, with modernity has been transposed to this immense faith in the market. But why it is immense and never ending? Because the idea of kind of have received life, which is a gift that can never be, anthropologically speaking, it's the only gift that you cannot return. So you are eternally in debt. It's not a Mosian gift that you can return, the gift of God's life, lives to, humans and sentient beings. It's unmatchable. It can never be returned. So if you translate that into the market, you know, theos as the market, it becomes, you know, is a never-ending desire that can never be matched. And here you are, the incommensurability of the desire of the market. So there are different forms in which people have been thinking about it. But another thing that I think is very interesting, and I'm sure people have been writing about it as I speak now, but it's also, you know, the financialization of the market. And so the miraculous. And it's interesting because in the theories of the miraculous, I think, you know, as the exceptions, which is, you know, another idea of kind of Carl-Schmitt, that the exception is conflated with the idea of the miraculous. But for Catholic theology, there is always a miraculous that has to be manifested, has to have a substance. You cannot have a miraculous without a substance in Catholicism. Absolutely not, which is really interesting. So it's to think capitalism and the financialization of capitalism is to think about where is that substantiation, what is the substance, the miraculous substance in the financial capitalism? And that is a very interesting question. So again, thinking the other way around. And I can think, you know, just as it comes to me now, I'll have to think more clearly here, but, you know, it's this kind of hypermediation is, you know, of course, is the explosions of social media, it's the explosion of refraction. So it is in this prismatic, mediatic refraction that in a way is a ceaseless movement. But at the same time, the substance is always promised and is always a promised substance. So it's a promise of incarnation, but it's not the incarnation as a revelation. So that conflict between promise and revelation at the heart of financial capitalism could be a way of thinking it. But, you know, we need to think, I mean, you know, economic theologians have been thinking about it, but kind of it's interesting for me, like, not for me, but, you know, for people interested in anthropology, not just in anthropology, but, you know, doing work with the lived and living Catholicism, is to see how this operates. And so some theological questions ask us, and so you think the field and you think it anew through this lens. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so just to take a wild turn onto my final point. So this now means that everybody else gets to pile in. So I'll try and be reasonably brief with this, and Valentina in return, and then we'll open it more widely until the end. So both of us work, Valentina, obviously on migrant experience, on migrant subjectivities, and the politics surrounding those subjectivities that constitutes and shapes those subjectivities. So I was really struck by your call to kind of, for us to embed ourselves again in time, to be focused on this durative present. Because one of the things certainly that I have found in my own research, my own empirical research with migrant communities, is that the nation state in the West in its current form, in terms of policies around migration, precisely attempts to stop migrants from being able to live well in the durative present. The structure of state policies is actually to distort deliberately and destroy a migrant's experience of time and temporality, to create rupture, to create simply extendable time in which nothing happens, to take you away from the way in which you normally would, you know, be embedded in the soil of time, as it were, to speak slightly in contradictory terms, but to take your idea of this kind of, you know, this kind of embedded and fleshed, placed reality, and that time relates in that sense to this process of being able to be in place. And I'm just wondering what then, if you're working with this idea of trying to get us into the durative present and out of the future perfect, what does your work on migrant subjectivities have to say to that challenge of wanting to live in the durative present? And isn't that something that's particularly difficult actually for a migrant to do, structured by current nation state policies, etc.?
I think I totally agree with, what you said, that exactly the nation states often absolutely interrupt this durative present or elongate it in ways that becomes even more sort of disorienting, the waiting. I think one of the way of thinking it's, which is, kind of a challenge for all of us is I'm thinking about the paradigm, well, sort of a conversation that Rosalind Morris at Columbia University in anthropology has been trying to think from, from South Africa and from Wise and from Johannesburg, thinking this kind of processes of mobility and migration as also processes of unsettlement that are much more extended, that they are not. So the idea of compartmentalizing the subject of the migrant as within a particular borderland, of course, this is the work we do, but also is to kind of extend to wider circulations and wider forms of unsettlement, which are financial, which are earth, which are land, which are, access of the land where you come from, and trying to articulate these wider notions of unsettlement where we are all included. So the questions also of, predatory capitalism, we live in a land, of course, we all live in different land, but also what is the relation to the land? So is to try to, if you want, do not short circuit the subject of the migrant to a particular confined and self-enclosed analysis, but try to articulate a wider history of the land and wider history of those people, of those ideas, things, and to make the point of unsettlement a point in common. So unsettlement is common to all of us. It's perhaps it's an existential common of life, and it's now particularly poignant. So that this kind of creating kind of doing the work of connecting those threads, so not isolate migrant subjectivity as within that space. And of course we need to document that space, because otherwise it becomes invisibilized and there is even more violence, but connect that condition of unsettlement to other condition of unsettlement. And in fact, if you think about close alliances between former precarious labor and kind of migrant subjectivities, once again, forms of political alliance, but also putting unsettlement as a core.
I think it's really interesting language, isn't it? I mean, one of the reasons that I was very drawn to Simone Weil, or drawn back to Simone Weil after 10 years of not working on her, was I'd gone back to do some work with the Jesuit Refugee Service in London, and I thought I was going to do a piece on thinking about Hannah Arendt and some of her work on statelessness and so forth, and the banality of evil. But in fact, I ended up going back and rereading Simone Weil at that point, who I had worked on previously, but I came back to precisely because I felt that I needed a non-exceptional language that didn't make migrants exceptional within the sort of account of what felt like it was going on culturally, because that felt like it was reproducing part of the logic of the state that I wanted to get away from, but also because what was being, I suppose, what I felt migrants were describing to me was what she calls uprootedness, and what you're calling a kind of, an unsettlement is very similar, I think, to her description of an uprooted condition, that modernity itself is uprooted. So what does it mean to pay attention to time and space and violence and the history of force in a context where our very way of living, which is embedded in our economic system, our political system, our cultural system, is about a fundamental uprootedness that we all share in, and yet migrants are the visible manifestation of in a very particular way. But a non-exceptional engagement with their experience has to engage with what's going on for the rest of us and those interconnections. So that's really helpful. Right.
Can I just think one other thing? And, in a positive, no, it's not positive or negative, but in an enabling way, I'm thinking, for example, the field of migrant families, and thinking, for example, of, mixed marriages. That's, I find it always a very interesting area, exactly because the substance become racialized and problematic in other forms from an outside context. And then what is the relation between form and substance? So when you start to have multiracial families, then you do have a real also theological question at stake, and a question of transformation that is not easy, but is a focus. So the interracial migrant family and what happens also in sort of second, third generation can be seen theologically also as a problem of substance, of incarnated substance. And yet problem in the sense of, creative and new fabulation, a new space, where perhaps an archive is lost at one level, not always, and at the same time, it's a generative of new potentiality, the family in that sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, we could go on all day, but we won't,
Yeah.
because other people have a right to be involved in the conversation.
Yeah.
So I've got one further question at the moment. I'm hoping some other people are perhaps going to, I mean, we've only got sort of 10, we've got about 10 minutes left, so we can perhaps, if we do quick question and Valentina does quick response, we can get through a few if people have got questions out there. So do start typing them in the Q&A box. But we've got one waiting already from Damien Costello, who says, wonderful thoughts, Valentina. How do you see your discussion of middle ground and different ways of engaging time and place? How do you see those relating to Indigenous ontologies and Indigenous theologies? Is there a sense that an aspect of lived Catholicism is the seeking to be more fully indigenous to place?
I totally agree with that. And it's really interesting, because we shouldn't, though, put the burden of being real ontological onto the shoulder of Indigenous people. And, again, being an anthropologist, I'm always very aware that, Indigenous society have their own history, have their own violence, have their own ups and downs. But at the same time, my work has been absolutely oriented, inspired by people who are not working on theologies, but, thinking about the gerundive, absolutely the gerundive. So the gerundive relation between land and people and sentient being, so that is always an articulation that is never taken for granted. It's not separated. It's the idea of like
Valentina, Valentina, do you want to tell people what you mean by the gerundive? Just so
the gerundive.
Just
I give you an example.
Who haven't heard that phrase before will know what you mean by it.
I give you an example, very, 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 very quick, and probably doesn't make any sense, but in a work by Marisol de la Cadena called The Earth Beings, she talks about basically a shaman that she's been following for very many years, and he talks about a particular land contestation that they had in the past. About they tried to exploit that land, and the indigenous Quechua, they were trying to sort of resist that, and he used a gerundive. It doesn't say that they won the war in the past, but they say it's like guerra ganar. Every time he talks about it, it's in the gerundive presence, like winning the war. So the war is never lived in the past, but it's kind of, while you walk, the idea of the archive. So it reminds you that rock, that water, it's the history of that war that, in a language of Future Perfect, was won, but is constantly so it's kind of gaining the war. So when you begin to have this kind of even ecological self in that sense, is never temporarily fixed. So the gerundive as something that is, of course, performative, but also is embedded in a continuous, it's embedded in the commons and response to it. So that even history is something alive to the moment in which it's called upon. That's really the idea of the gerundive that I'm inspired by anthropologists working, not on theology, but on ontologies more. Yeah, did I answer it? Did I answer?
Yeah. No, I mean, I just wanted to leap in at that point, just because you've used that phrase a few times, and I'm aware there'll be some people who are very in that area, and other people perhaps attending this who wouldn't be so much so. I mean, I think it's also a helpful reminder that there's a danger of loading onto Indigenous communities and theologies a certain set of expectations and a burden, a kind of historical, a contemporary burden that has its own ethical, sort of questions that we might ask of it as well, for sure. Okay, do we have any other questions? I'm going to give a moment to see whether there's anybody else who's sitting on a question that they would like to ask to Valentina, or a contribution they'd like to make into the conversation that she and I have been having. If not, I will leap in with two other questions very briefly, because we've only got 5 minutes before we end. Okay, no question just yet. Somebody may well be typing away. So Valentina, one of the things you talked about at the end when you were talking about family was you picked up on Pope Francis and the way, which I think is really interesting, and the way in which he offers I mean, he has said positive things about the family, as it were, in all sorts of contexts, but his appeal constantly is to build new and plural forms of associative life. He's been very clear, every Catholic should join a movement. You know, he wants this complex associational structure that will regenerate, and he's not at all worried if that has multiple different forms and is even quite cacophonous, moving in different directions. And his notion is almost, you know, it's the life of the commons, or the common good, if we were comfortable to use that language. It's quite an agonistic, pluralistic, you know, he uses these musical metaphors all the time, so that it's like multiple notes striking, and he reaches for that analogy. So he wants this very kind of rich, complex, associative life to regenerate things. So he wants a kind of a structure of alliance to build this commons. So I wondered if I could sort of push you to talk a bit more. You've given us this clarion call for the commons, and it clearly has some kind of complex associative structure for you. What kind of vision of an associational life do you have that gets us into this durative present that allows us to think about these 360-degree dimensions, the ecological, the economic, the political, the spiritual, theological, etc. What does this life of the commons and its associational structures and life look like for you?
Wow, that's like a big question, but you know, really big questions that I'm really grateful, because I think it's a line that I'm trying to think more, and perhaps I cannot say it just right now in a sentence, but I'm trying to say, first of all, going back to Francis and this kind of cacophonic, you know, sounds that, which I found again is so criollo. You know, it's in relation to Benedict XVI, which is the problem of the verticality of sovereignty. You know, it's the inheritance, it's a certain relation to the roots. You know, Benedict talks so much about the roots. Francis talked about the routes, you know, the roots, not the roots, but the root, you know, the sort of horizontal.
Yeah.
So, you know, an American pope, because it's also the conundrum of certain type of coloniality. You know, like if we think about Francis as also a process of coloniality, you know, it's a pope that has not been able as yet to refute the famous Tordesillas, you know, the 1493 kind of you know, treaty that, you know, the church has been basically availing the Spanish Empire to, you know, to exploit the resources of the land and indigenous people in the Americas, has not been able to. So all this contradiction. And yet I think that the movement, and also sort of been writing about him, about distance and withdrawing. So the touch as central to his, the touch event as central of his papacy. And yet what that one looks like, you know, in the real ground, I think it's very much, I mean, a question that for me hinges on thinking the religious as a force. So we also have to acknowledge, you know, and that's also the loss of what one has to let go, that perhaps is not framed in terms of a Catholicism that is recognized as such, because I think also there is a process of mourning, as there is a process of mourning for the left in Europe. So there is a process of mourning of Catholicism in that form. But if we recognize the power and the field force of incarnation as a flight as well as the horizontal flight, and I'm sort of evoking a bit Deleuze there, but we can think that force as animated, as founded in particular aggregation that we may not call religious. So my way of thinking is like, try to find that force, that call it as you want it, a force of the religion, a force of the spiritual, a force of the incarnated, that on which then Catholicism with a very long tradition can shed light, because it's not about new religious movement. It's not about new religious movement. I mean, at least for me, it's not about the new social formation around it, but it's to think about that field of forces that can be violent, because as we know also is sacrificial, but at the same time, it can be very generative. So housing, for example, this is how politics of dwelling is changing. For example, it's changing cross-generational. And we know that, you know, a certain formation of capital is for this formation of nuclear family is coming to an end. I mean, we are still living into it, but it's coming to an end. We cannot live in older age, in younger age, in these forms of dwellings. We need to share. So practically also is to think different politics of dwellings, you know, how do we start to live in a different ways, that we are connected, and perhaps, you know, kind of ethnographically thinking, you know, and also generative. So not just studying what is there, but how we can propose as also theological new forms of living. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Excellent. That's plenty. And brings us exactly up to time.
I can see Avril up here.
1 minute over. Yeah, no, that's right. The presence of Avril, who is the true sovereign. So the sovereignty of Avril shall rule. Valentina, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and the dialogue and the conversation. We're hugely in your debt. So thank you very much. And I will hand back to Avril.
I just thank you so much, both of you. How fantastic to have that conversation going on from two different perspectives, but so many connections and so many new ideas sparking. So thank you so much for that. And I'm rubbish at these introductions. So I should have said that Valentina co-edited a really fantastic, the reader on the anthropology of Catholicism, which has been so formative for me in my own reading. And that Anna was very important to working with Pope Francis on Fratelli Tutti. So we've got two amazing women, amazingly influential women having a conversation on the screen in front of us. So thank you to both of you for that. Our next session is a workshop session with Robert Orsi, who has been mentioned more than anybody else, I think, this whole conference. He is the granddaddy and completely the living embodiment, really, of lived Catholicism. And we are talking about doing lived Catholicism, the methodological, the epistemological issues that arise when we study Catholicism as scholars. So that is our next session. We have 20 minutes to go and get some fresh air, and then we'll all be back in. And I've been aware that some people were not able to get into the parallel sessions this afternoon, so I do apologise for that, and hope that all the links are working for the rest of the afternoon now. So thank you, enjoy the break, and see you again soon.